Welcome back to the Band Guide, where we use GarageBand to create professional sounding music. I'm your band guy, Colin, and this video is going to be a little bit different. I just launched my brand new course, EQ Expert, and today we're going to look at a sneak peek from that course. Now, EQ Expert is all about teaching you everything you need to know for you to become an EQ expert and start creating professional sounding mixes from your home with no new gear at all. In fact, the song that we demonstrate on inside the course was recorded during quarantine in 4 different homes across the state of Virginia, none of which had proper home studio setups. So you can take what you're learning in this course and apply it to your home studio recordings and create professional sounding mixes. I guarantee it. Now, this course is going to be closing at midnight Pacific time tomorrow, so if it interests you, be sure to go to the link in the description below and just get more details. But the sneak peek that I'm bringing you today is an entire lesson from this course. I pulled an entire lesson out of this course that's all on the 6 EQ zones. These can really unlock EQ for you. This will change the way that you look at EQ and think about EQ, and will just help you better understand and use an EQ. So I really think it's going to help you. I hope you enjoy this lesson from EQ Expert, but before we do that, I want to share a little something with you. If you're not sure that EQ is the tool to get professional sounding mixes, just listen to this mix with and without EQ. When we're approaching EQ, we tend to get hung up on this idea that EQ is infinitely adjustable. And that's kind of true, right? Most EQs have multiple filters that have multiple parameters that can all be adjusted across the entire frequency spectrum from 20 Hz all the way up to 20,000 Hz. That is a lot of options. But we need to adjust this thinking when we're approaching EQ for 2 main reasons. The first is that this is completely paralyzing. If we're holding all of these limitless options equal, how could we possibly feel like we know what to do with EQ and are able to get a good EQ sound? The second is that it's just fundamentally flawed. The reality is that not all of these options are equal. Sound sounds very different at different points across the frequency spectrum. We could basically break this down into 6 zones, and every EQ essentially just has 6 zones that all sound very, very different. And instead of treating EQ like it has limitless options, we should zero in on these 6 zones, familiarize ourselves with the way these 6 zones sound, so that way when we pull up an EQ, instead of sweeping and just trying to find anything across the entire EQ that sounds bad to us and cutting that, that's a fool's errand, right? Instead of doing that, we're going to listen to our sources, we're going to be already aware of what these different zones sound like, and then we're going to go after those zones. So for example, you could pull up a vocal and say, this vocal sounds a little bit muddy. There's probably a little buildup in the low mids. Let me go find those and cut them out a little bit. Or I want this guitar to have a little more presence. Let me go find that frequency in that zone and boost that a little bit. And the reality is that most of our sources don't even need all 6 of these zones. Some only need 5 zones, some only need 4 zones. They literally don't even make sound in the other 2 zones, so we don't need to be thinking about those zones. So instead of pulling up an EQ and feeling like we have limitless options with a lot of our sources, we now have 4 zones that we're looking at. And within those zones, we're either cutting or we're boosting frequencies. Those are the only 2 options that we actually have. So on those sources, instead of limitless options, we now have 8 options. We're either cutting or boosting across 4 zones. Even if we're talking about sources that need frequencies across all 6 zones, we only have 12 options. That's a lot more manageable than limitless options, wouldn't you say? So in this video, what I want to do is get familiarized with these 6 zones. Look at these 6 zones across an entire mix. We'll boost some frequencies, we'll cut some, we'll get familiarized with what they sound like so that you can really start to use these to get better mixes. Let's dive in. Okay, so the 6 zones are going to span across the entire frequency spectrum from 20 Hz all the way up to 20,000 Hz. And we're going to start down here in the sub-frequencies. This is the frequencies we more feel than hear, but we can hear them depending on what we're listening on. So if you're listening on a phone or on your laptop speakers, you're probably not going to be able to hear this at all. But if you're listening in a good pair of speakers or good headphones, you'll likely be able to hear it a little bit. So this is really 60 Hz and below. And we're going to boost this, and let's listen to what this sounds like in our mix. Higher, higher, oh, I'll take you higher, higher, oh my love. it adds the fullness, right? It really makes our song sound very, very full. Now, what happens if we just kind of take it away? Let's listen to that.
Higher, higher, oh, I'll take you higher, higher, oh my love, you're a wanted man.
So we really want to have these frequencies present to have a really full sounding mix. So as we continue move up the frequency spectrum, the next thing that we run into is our bass frequencies. These are our frequencies from about 60 hertz up to about 200 hertz. And this is still kind of where we're getting the fullness in our mix. Let's listen to these frequencies just a little bit.
Higher, higher, oh, I'll take you higher, higher, oh my love, you're a wanted
cut
man, but I wanted you to know my name.
So this is where we really start to be able to hear low-end frequencies. If we have too much, it's going to sound boomy, but if we don't have enough, then it's going to sound like there's just no fullness in our mix. So the sub-frequencies and the bass frequencies really play together to add the low end to our song. And then from there, we move up to our low-mid frequencies. This is from about 200 hertz up to about 500 hertz. Now, these frequencies are often where we get the warmth in our mix. That makes our mix sound really warm. But if there's too much, then this is also where we get muddiness or boxiness. I'm sure you've heard people talk about that before. There's typically a lot of buildup in these frequencies. So you do want to be on the lookout for these frequencies to have some buildup or to have all of your tracks building up around these frequencies. Let's listen to these in the context of the mix.
Higher, higher, oh, I'll take you higher, higher, oh my love, you're a wanted man, but I wanted you to know my name.
If we don't have enough, it sounds pretty hollow, right? We don't have that warmth.
Don't push me away, girl.
we have too
I'm not here to
much.
save you, and you don't need to explain.
It sounds kind of muddy. It sounds kind of boxy, right? I think that those are really good words for the way that feels when there's too much of that. So, and then as we move up, we start to get into the real mids of the song. And this is really the body of the song, right? This is where a lot of the good tone of the song lives. But if we have too much of this, then it starts to sound really tinny. So let's boost this and let's just get familiarized with these frequencies.
Higher, higher, oh, I'll take you higher, higher, oh my love.
If we don't have enough,
You're a wanted man, but I wanted you to know my name.
so we definitely need those in there. This is about 500 hertz up to about 2000 hertz. This is the true mid-range of the song. These frequencies are really, really important, but you don't want to have too much, you don't want to have too little. So you just have to figure out how to balance this just right in your mix. And then we're moving up into where we really start to have the presence of our song, where we really start to hear stuff really, really well. Articulation, this is great for some guitars or the crack of the snare drum. But if we have too much of this, then we start to get some harshness out of our song, right? This is the range we've already talked about, that 2 to 4K range is where we are really sensitive in our ears. So too much of this is going to sound really harsh and it's not going to sound good to us. Now, typically the upper mids are generally about 2K up to about 5K. So 2000 hertz up to about 5000 hertz. Let's listen to these.
Higher, higher, oh, I'll take you higher, higher, oh my love. You're a wanted man, but I wanted you to know my name.
So if we lose that, we just lose all the presence in our song. It definitely is really, really important frequency range. And then as we get to the top here, we're looking at 5K to 2000K. This is really the brightness, right? This is where things start to cut through in the vocals, the airiness on the cymbals. This is really the air frequency, if you've heard that term. These frequencies are really, really important to have a nice bright mix. But if you have too much, then it starts to sound really brittle. Let's listen to that.
Higher, higher, oh, I'll take you higher, higher, oh my push me away.
It's pretty interesting, right? So, I mean, again, important frequencies. All of these zones have important frequencies that make our mixes sound great. But too much is always going to sound bad in some way, and too little is going to sound bad in a different way. So we need to find a way to balance these things. Now, they're going to sound a little bit different on every individual source. They're still going to be tied to the fundamental frequencies and all that good stuff that we've already talked about. But they are going to sound a little bit different on each source just because each source is going to sound a little bit different. Now, the last thing I want to just briefly mention is we've talked about the smile curve before. That's basically a little bit of boost up here in the top and a little bit of boost down at the bottom. Let me show you what that sounds like on the master track, on the overall mix.
Higher, higher, oh. Take you higher, higher, oh my love. You're a wanted man, but I wanted you to know my name.
So listen to this if we just turn off. This is a smile curve, right? It's a little of a smile here. We boost to the lows and then boost the highs. Let's listen without this EQ on.
Higher, higher, oh.
So the smile curve on a master fader can be, or on the master track, can be really, really powerful. It's a great way to just bring out that low end and that brightness that our ears tend to favor, that makes sources sound a little bit louder. It's really, really powerful. So those are the 6 EQ zones. We want to master those. Those are going to unlock EQ for you. This is how you're going to get the most out of your EQ. And if you familiarize yourself with how it sounds on every individual source, then you're really going to be able to take control of your EQ and take control of your mix altogether. I hope you enjoyed that sneak peek of EQ Expert. I really think the 6 zones of EQ are an important foundational way to look at EQ to start understanding and using it better. Now, EQ Expert is designed to teach you everything that you need to know about EQ, including the EQ process that I use every time I mix to help me get professional sounding mixes. But it doesn't just give you a process for how to use EQ, it goes in depth on the behind the scenes stuff that are affecting EQ and why we need to EQ and EQ hotspots and plugin order and so much more. It is truly everything you need to know to become an EQ expert. If this sounds like something you're interested in, it closes at midnight tomorrow night, so be sure to check out the link in the description below. If this video is helpful, be sure to subscribe. I'll see you next week with another video.
One thing at a time. I can only handle one thing at a time. One thing